it was something that I decided in college rather late. I had been a biology major. Then I had to really make a decision on how I was going to make a living. So I did switch to pre-med in my junior year and had to catch up and got some biochemistry in. But it was various things. I liked science, and I liked the idea. For a long time, I think I hesitated, didn't make an early decision because I think I was afraid to say, I want to be a doctor, then I couldn't do it. None of us like to think that we can't make what we want to do. But there was one thing that crossed my mind growing up that had something to do with picking medicine. And it was sort of almost subconscious, but I do remember World War II, and I remember Korea, and I remember friends and relatives going to war and somehow coming back. And I watched war movies, and they bothered me a whole lot. And I just thought, I could never do it. I'm not going to pick up a rifle. I knew I couldn't do that. So I thought, well, probably drafted someday, but I'm not going to shoot people. So I decided I want to be on the side of helping save lives. And I think that attitude helped me go into OB/GYN. And it turned out that I was drafted in 1960. So I think that had something to do with it. But I think it's a real honor. People ask me, except for, getting married and having your children, what other events do you find that were really exciting in your life? And really, for me, it was finishing college and finishing medical school, finishing medical training, finishing the Air Force, and then finally being well enough trained to take on the position of being a physician and being entrusted with not only taking care of patients, but new life. And that was a big event for me because, it was finally, I was doing what I had been working for so long. That was a big event. And I always missed medicine. I was in Congress for 4 terms in the 70s, and I always thought I got involved in politics sort of as a fluke because I wanted to speak out about the economics. I got interested in that. But when I was in Congress in the 70s and early 80s, I had no desire to stay and work up the ladder and become the chairman of a committee and all that. So I went back, and I was out of Congress then for 12 years in effective medicine.
And you recently unveiled a dramatic plan to balance the budget in 3 years. In the first year alone, you cut $1 trillion. Why does cutting government spending help the economy? A lot of opponents would say you want to spend more money when the economy is growing.
A lot of people look at, well, if you're going to cut, that's a net loss, and that weakens the economy. That's not the way it works. The choice is who gets to spend the money. You get to spend the money, or the government gets to spend the money. And my assumptions turned out to be pretty correct even before I went to Washington. After being there, meeting a few politicians and a few bureaucrats, believe me, they don't know enough to tell you how to spend your money. And I want you to make their decisions. So for the government to tax or borrow money or even inflate is taking wealth production away from the people and putting it into the hands of other individuals who don't know the answers in a distort market. So the debt burden is overwhelming, and that's why the crisis is here today, and that's why we had finally the bubble bursting 4 years ago in 2008, and the problems even yesterday facing in Europe. There's debt problems, debt. There's too much, and it's like an individual or company that has way too much debt, and they're not making any money. Well, they're going to have to go out of business. They can't keep farming. They might be able to do it for a year or two, but finally the bankers won't loan them money, and individuals can go out and get another credit card, and some get as many as 10, but you can't get 11 and 12 and 13. Eventually, you have to cut back. You have to work harder and pay down your debt. You don't get economic growth until you do something with the debt, and nobody wants to do anything with the debt. And that's why we have these ongoing crises internationally in the finance as well as in Congress. I mean, here we have a super committee and we have the Congress, and they're always supposed to, restrain the spending and get the budget back in order and how you're going to raise the national debt limit. But economic law finally gets you to a point where nothing works. The debt is just too big. I mean, a third of our budget is debt. It's $1.5 trillion, and we have to borrow most of that from overseas, and we already owe $3 trillion. But the real problem is the denial, and that's why I want to emphasize that you have to cut back. If individuals have to cut back, if businesses have to cut back, cities actually have to cut back. And you've done a good job here. You knew that you had to cut back, and you're making these efforts here, and that is good. We just need a lot more of it. But at the national level, you might say, oh no, they're talking about cutting, and the super committee didn't do any super work, so we're going to have some automatic cuts. But there are no cuts. This is what we have to understand. They have what they call baseline budgeting, that they have a steady increase forever. And if you cut the increase a little bit and not increase the budget quite as much, they get hysterical because it's a cut. It isn't a cut. The $1 trillion you're talking about is a cut, and I think that's what is necessary. And you won't get economic growth back again until you recognize this and you get rid of the debt. You have to liquidate the debt, and you have to liquidate what they call malinvestment. That is, when a business community is deceived by artificially low interest rates by the Federal Reserve, what tends to happen when bubbles are built and overbuilding occurs, maybe too many houses are built and too many hotels and shopping centers, and you have to clear that market, and the sooner you clear it, the better. But unfortunately, under today's understanding in Washington, they think they have to prop it up or take the debt from the privileged class, dump it on the American taxpayers. That's where the real tragedy is. The debt that the banks and the savings, and not the savings, the banks and the builders and the credit organizations like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the mortgage people, they took all that debt and they dumped it on us in a way that was done through the Congress and was done through the Federal Reserve. That is the wrong thing. You have to liquidate the debt in order to get back working again.
Thank you. So I was an Air Force pilot, and I flew overseas quite a bit, and I was involved between the Gulf Wars flying out of Saudi Arabia, and I realized very quickly that we were defending Saudi Arabia. We weren't defending our country. And then also, I got involved in the Civil War in Bosnia. So I, throughout my military career, saw a big distinction between defense spending, or defense, and overseas military, which is one of the things that drew me to your campaign. You're proposing a lot of cuts out of the military. Your spending cuts come from kind of what you call overseas military, or does it come from defense? And how strong would you see defense under a Paul presidency?
Right. Now, he asked the question correctly, and ordinarily the question is asked incorrectly, but this morning on one of the radio talk shows, I had one of the interviewers ask it, and he stated it right. And what he said was, he's talking about, do I want to cut military spending, and what do you want to do about defense spending? And we have to think of those as two different things, because military spending is, and our operations overseas, so if you add up everything, all the foreign aid and the activity and the bases that we have, we're spending like $1.4 trillion, so that is big, but that's military spending, and it's almost a negative. In some ways it's a negative because we get ourselves into trouble. We do a lot of flying and a lot of bombing, and we support dictators, and we're picking and choosing, and we go after some bad guys, and obviously there are some bad guys out there, but the way we do it is sometimes we drop these bombs on people, and some other people die. And that's collateral damage. They don't cut that as people, but they're real people. They die, and that's why they get angry at us. And one thing I try to get people to do is see the difference between military spending of that type of activity and defending this country. I would think we would do a lot better in our country if we took the golden rule and applied it to foreign policy. When we think about it, and I would as the president, I would always think, okay, now the position has been that we're in these 130 countries, we have 900 bases. What would we say if somebody did that to us? What if somebody bombed cruise missiles and these drones on our country? I mean, we wouldn't be very happy about that. So I think that whole attitude has to change. Defending this country is a big, one of the most important functions of the federal government, protecting liberty, sound money, national defense. But if we spend all this money in doing more what Eisenhower warned us against, watch out. The military-industrial complex may just drive these things. And just think of all the weapons we're building now. Some of these weapons are pretty old-fashioned when you think that computers now, they can probably hit any postage stamp in the world. Why do we have to have bases, and why do we have to own all these countries from Iraq to Afghanistan and be involved, and they tend to backfire. So spending money on defense would cost a lot less, and we would have a stronger defense. That's what I'm looking for.
And what? I'm going to add to that, that you're getting the most donations from active duty military, and I'm certainly somebody who served 12 years and supports you. So this is a pro-defense, not anti-military, not anti-defense.
Yeah, I've been very flattered by that, and really saying, actually, our campaign gets twice as much as everybody else put together from the active military people. Because sometimes we get accused if we take this position, oh, you're not strong on defense, and you're not for the troops, and this sort of thing. Well, let's just ask the troops how many times they want to go to Afghanistan and Iraq. 1, 2, 5. When are they going to get tired? 5 times? And just think, for everybody that has to go over there, they have spouses and children, they have relatives, and think how many have died in those 2 wars. If you add up contractors, everybody else, 8,500 died, 40,000 injured, hundreds of thousands are begging and pleading for help now from the VA because of so much of the post-traumatic stress syndrome. And suicide is actually an epidemic right now in our people that came back. I think the military know exactly what I'm talking about. I hear it every day from people that have been serving overseas.
One of the other things that got you motivated to get involved in politics, I know, was the belief that a fiat currency would last and would collapse. And driving down the road, and I hear the collapse of the euro. So that's starting to be actually talked about. The stock market rallied yesterday with the news that the Federal Reserve will bail out the European banks. How will this affect the average American?
It's going to hurt big time because they've been trying to settle that debt over there. They won't admit that there's a debt crisis and it can't be paid, and Greece should have just defaulted and get it off the books and go back to work. But instead, it's banks have bought this debt, so they don't. Banks are too big to fail. Other people are too little to be worried about it. The banks are too big to fail. So they have it planned. So still, the dollar technically is very weak. It's worth 3 cents to the dollar that the Federal Reserve inherited. Inflation is here, and yet it's still the most trusted currency in the world. So it doesn't say much about the yen and the euro. And but there's a limit to how long it can bail out everybody. But yesterday was an announcement that they were going to give dollars to the banks and the central banks of Europe in exchange for some of their currency, which guarantees that value will go down. And those dollars we print and send over there will dilute the money supply, and we're going to get inflation and a weaker currency. So it's propping up bad debt, and when you destroy a currency, just generally speaking, it undermines the middle class. The middle class gets smaller, and that's what we're witnessing. The unemployment falls on the middle class and the poor, and they lose their jobs, so they get a poorer job, but then prices go up. And those prices going up, you have to remember, you can't say, well, it's union wages that does it, or it's profits that do it. Prices go up for the most part because the value of the money goes down. And if governments inflated the money, if they doubled the money supply and all our wages went up and all our income went up twice as much and profits went up, it wouldn't be a problem, but that's not the way it works. The people who get the money first or who get the bailout, they benefit. That money is transferred to them, and then another class of people suffer the consequence. That's why it's so unfair. So that announcement yesterday, it created euphoria, 500 points in the stock market. But I recall, and I frequently mention this when I really got interested in pursuing economics and speaking out on it, was in 1971 when the Bretton Woods Agreement, which was a pseudo-gold standard, started in 1944. It was a part of a gold standard, even though we weren't allowed to own gold. That fell apart in 1971, and Nixon did that by executive order. He put on wage and price controls. He put on a 10% tariff all the very worst things you could do. And I thought, holy man, how could anybody do this, let alone by an executive order? But the stock market the next day went up more in one day than it had gone up in all the history of the stock market. So the market saw this as good news. I saw it as very bad news. But if you look at the history of the 1970s, it was really a tough decade because remember by 1980, it was the misery index and Reagan won because unemployment was high, inflation was high. So my belief is that type of thing that went on yesterday, no matter, or the day before, I guess, and what the stock market did yesterday is not a reflection of what's coming. I think that is bad news for us, and it's bad news for our dollar. It props up debt, where we have to liquidate debt. So unfortunately, we haven't changed our tune, and that's what I've been talking about for a long time, trying to prevent this. And now that we're here, we have to understand what we need to do. What I'm talking about isn't easy, but it's a lot easier than pursuing this and destroying the currency. That is political risk. There could be chaos and riots and everything else because people aren't going to be very happy. What I want to do is work our way out of it. And up until the Depression, that's what we did. A recession, depression would come in a year, it would be over, and people would allow the debt to be liquidated, and they went back to work. In 1921, we had a bad depression, but it's a non-event because it didn't last. The Depression, the Big Depression, we know about because we thought, oh no, we can't allow this to happen. We have to manage everything, and the Depression never ended until after World War II.
Okay, that's all the questions we have from me, but we will open up now for questions from the audience. I just remind people, please leave it to the undecided voters to ask questions first. Right here, sir.
Hello? I'm interested in keeping Social Security solid in the future. The earnings cap next year is $110,000. In order to make Social Security available for young people, would you be in favor of lifting that earnings cap?
He's asking about trying to make Social Security solvent, which is a major task. Maybe sometime, but my program of the first 3 years, I think if they would cut the spending that I want, you wouldn't have to do that, but I think eventually you would have to do something like raising the cap and changing the arithmetic on it. But the real tragedy is that it was sold to the American people as being an insurance program, and we'd pay into it, and we would have our account, and we would get money back again. But all that money was spent. There's no money there, and it was spent in the general revenue, and I blame all this excessive spending overseas to the tune of trillions of dollars that we have spent. That's why I want to attack that first, cut overseas. And even though some of these programs probably should have never been started because I don't trust government to manage them very well, but I do believe we should do what we can to take care of the people who have become dependent. So I go after the overseas spending, the useless wars that have been going on. Some of our departments, like the Department of Education, believe me, that's not a necessary department. And not cut Social Security. But I think your suggestion about looking at long term, after a few years, you might have a tremendous economic, if we would do all the things I'm talking about, you'd have economic growth within 2 or 3 years. So the numbers may improve at that time. Matter of fact, the other thing, even though I want to work to take care of people who are medically dependent, and the elderly are receiving, fixed incomes. But if we don't do that, it's going to be catastrophic, and everybody is going to suffer. So I would work in that direction, and at the meantime, I'm also saying, which is very popular with young people, I think people, and to phase this out, I would phase it out because the government has messed it up so badly. So I offer the opportunity for people under 25. They're getting out of college right now. They've gotten this education that was sort of pushed on them because the credit was made easy. They're graduating at a time the education quality went down. They have $1 trillion worth of debt and they have no jobs. So it's a pretty failed policy. But I would like to see young people, once again, assume responsibility and allow them to opt out. Just like a lot of people now want to opt out of Obamacare, which I think is a good idea. Out, which would further hasten the day, possibly, for what you're saying. How are you going to do the finances? You know, are you going to change his retirement date? Right now, though, the proposal I have, I don't deal with that because we would cut enough from overseas. But that's where the real challenge is. American people have been conditioned that, you know, we have this moral obligation to be the policemen of the world, and, you know, and we are so wonderful, and we can tell people how to live, but they don't stop and think, well, why do we subsidize Germany's defense, and why do we keep troops in Japan, and why are we in South Korea, and on and on. It's such a, to me, a welcome area where we should be able to get together, liberals and conservatives should be able to get together and say, look, this is tough, we need to do something, and maybe we ought to be able to agree on this and bring people together. So it's a tough sale. The people in the country we have to get people to understand that we have to change our attitude about foreign policy, and we have to change our attitude about the assumption that the federal government is necessary to take care of us forever, whether it's education or medical care or whatever, because at the rate we're going, they're not going to be able to, because they're going to destroy the money, and all these programs, you know, just default, and they don't work anyway. So I don't see any other option than cutting spending and cut where it's most easy to cut, and that to me is overseas.
Congressman Paul, I'm a third voter, and I'll be taking the Republican ballot on January 10th. I just have to say you're for repealing Obamacare. What we should do instead, and I know the libertarian, you might say it's individual responsibility, and let the free market take care of it, but I do have trouble that that person doesn't take insurance and ends up in the emergency room. I'm going to end up paying for it. Right. So where's your solution, sir?
Well, the first thing is if we don't have Obamacare, medical care costs are going to be a lot lower. That pushes costs up. Whether the Republicans give us prescription drug programs, Obama gives us Obamacare, the biggest lobbyists that have the most influence on that legislation are the insurance companies and the drug companies, and they seem to do quite well. I practiced medicine before we had Medicare or Medicaid in the early 60s when I first got out of medical school. And I worked in a Catholic hospital, and I made a tremendous salary there. I made $3 an hour, and I worked 12 hours overnight. But one thing that was magnificent, nobody was ever turned away. Everybody got charged whatever they could afford. They were charged the least. But today, the whole attitude is different. We have the legal crisis because we're put under pressure to over-order tests. You have a bump on your head, and you got a $15,000 bill going in an emergency room, so the whole thing has been messed up. But let's say somebody comes over illegally, and I deliver an infant in the emergency room, and they become a citizen. They immediately get put in the hospitals and put them on Medicaid, so that they can get some revenues in. So everybody charges the most. When the government pays the bills, or any third party pays the bills, doctors yield to the temptations, as hospitals do, and labs. Everybody gets charged the maximum. It's exactly opposite of the way it should be. They should be charged the least in what people can pay. So this is something that we can take care of, but not under this current system. But my program deals with it on the short run, what I talk about on Social Security. People who are dependent, especially the children and the elderly, if they're dependent on that medical care, that's what I'm trying to protect until we can work our way out of this. But if we don't do this, there's going to be no doctors, there's not going to be any emergency rooms, there's going to be total chaos because you're going to have runaway inflation, and that's going to be a much more serious problem. But we should encourage the return of the doctor-patient relationship, where the doctor and the patients they're talking to each other. And what we should have is an encouragement of the medical savings accounts, which are being discouraged by Obamacare, which means that if you can put away $3,000 or $4,000 a year, this would be especially attractive to young people. You get that to write off your taxes. If you don't spend it, you get to keep it.